Earlier today, AnandTech posted a review of the Core i7-11700K, Intel's new Rocket Lake processor, and, well, we're still under NDA, but we can talk about this. So we've brought Steve in, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion, so let's get to it. Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It's a bit of an unusual situation, which is why we've brought Monitor Steve in, fresh from his holiday, to talk a little bit about what has been going on with the new Core i7-11700K review that we've seen from AnandTech that was posted just a couple of hours ago before I think we went live, just 3 or 4 hours ago. So we've taken a look through, and yeah, how have you been though first? You had a bit of a holiday, we've had a bit of YouTube drama, and this is your first sort of thing back on the channel. Yeah,
well, I'm very glad that my holiday's now over and I can be back on the channel. So a bit of a stressful period there, as I'm sure many of the viewers are aware. Kind of ruined my holiday, let's be honest. I had a couple of relaxing days there at the end when this was all resolved. But yeah, at this point, I'm just so glad that I was able to get back from the holiday and we could upload new content without having to wonder how long it was going to be before those issues were resolved. So very happy about that. Can get back to work. Bit of a shame about the holiday, but the family had fun and whatnot. Just a bit stressful for me. So anyway, as I said, let's just get into this one. I'm excited to do some new content. It's been about 3 weeks for me since I've actually produced something new for the channel. As I'm sure many people are aware, Tim's been sort of carrying us a bit over the last few weeks with a lot of content. So it's my turn
it's been fun
to do something. Yeah, wow.
Yeah, I thought this is kind of the perfect thing to get you back in the swing of doing content. I know you've been working on your RTX 3060 review, so that should be on the channel soon, but we kind of delayed that a little bit just because of this news. So this is a very interesting scenario because we don't often get this sort of thing happening in the tech press, because basically the normal situation is we get like a news embargo for the processors or whatever new product is coming up, then we can't talk about anything until that embargo expires. And then there's going to be a later embargo for the reviews. So that's, for all products, that tends to be a fairly standard way of doing things. And of course, you can't publish anything that you've learnt in any of those things. Even if you have the products on hand before the news embargo, whatever, you have to follow those strict instructions. But NDAs never apply when you can buy the product. So we're in a very unique situation with this AnandTech review where they have gone and bought a Core i7-11700K. And sorry if I'm not looking directly at the camera because I've got the article that we're going to be looking at over here as well. But yes, Intel, for some reason, some of their partners had been selling 11700Ks, I believe in Europe, in some regions there. There are a couple of retailers that basically broke the sales embargo. The sales embargo, I believe on this part, is around the same time as the review embargo, so that will be later in March. But for some reason, they just decide to sell them. So of course, when that happens, you can go and produce any sort of reviews, talk about them, because NDAs do not apply to retail products. And because this is a retail review, we can talk about their review, which is a very interesting situation. It's kind of, we can't talk about any of the performance data that we may or may not have. We can't talk about any of the news that we've may or may not be under NDA about. So we have to be pretty careful what we say here. But I think it'll be interesting to go through and analyze some of this stuff. But first of all, I did want to ask you, Steve, what do you think about publishing this sort of review like this? Are you fine with this?
Yeah, I don't really have a problem with it. It's fair play to AnandTech. They got a sample well ahead of time. It's not like they've undercut other reviewers by a few days, which I think would be seen as being a little bit dirty. But because it's so far in advance, I don't see that as being too much of an issue. Having said that, I don't expect performance or anything to change between now and March 30th when you should be able to see our review. But I think it sort of undercuts us a bit if they get in just a few days ahead, whereas it's quite a few weeks. I think we're talking about 3.5 weeks or something at this point.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, if I was in the situation they're in where I had the sample now and it wasn't under NDA, I think I'd go ahead and release our review as well. So, yeah, fair play to AnandTech. Don't have any problem with what they've done here. And really, it's Intel's stuff up, or at least something that they have to deal with the retailers and I suppose their partners in the industry. And it's not something you really do see from, say, an AMD or, in particular, NVIDIA. Certainly doesn't happen with NVIDIA. And Intel has done a pretty bad job, I would say, over the past few releases of not letting things leak out. And this is obviously pretty bad. It's 3.5 weeks before you're actually meant to be able to buy one. And a reviewer has one in hand and is able to review it.
We're not even supposed to be able to tell people what the processes are because the news embargo on all of this hasn't expired yet either. So we are in that really weird situation. But I agree with everything you say. I think there might be some people that are a little bit salty about, not getting an exclusive or not having this stuff published right around the time as everyone else. But again, it's all on Intel. Well, it's not even on them. I guess it's on them from a perspective that they should have maybe not allowed these into the retail channel so early, because if a retail's got it now and the sales embargo is at the end of March, that's quite a long time. But it's also on that particular retailer and the retailers that have been selling these products. And I imagine there'll be very significant repercussions for this. Very, very significant from Intel. I imagine there's a lot of internal mumblings and rumblings going on from their legal department about what they're going to do with this, and I would expect those retailers to be blacklisted.
Maybe. Be aware we don't know what has and hasn't been said leading up to this. And
that's true.
I don't want to derail what we're meant to be getting into here, but if you remember with our Skylake X reviews, the problems we had with Intel and a particular partner during that, and the communication on Intel's end about what was allowed to be shown and what processes could be reviewed was very poor. But Intel weren't happy about the situation, but it was a situation they created. So who knows what's happened here? I don't care to speculate, really. So basically it has happened. Intel shouldn't have allowed it to happen, and they'll have to make steps in the future to make sure this stuff doesn't happen again, I suppose.
Yeah, they do need to get their leaks under control, because it feels like the past couple of launches we've seen leaked benchmarks for weeks and weeks coming up to the release. It's not usual to get a retail sample like this. Usually it comes through your partners and that sort of thing who send it out to people they shouldn't be early, or their system integrators or whatever. But so the retail situation does make this quite an interesting situation, and again, not under NDA. These sort of things NDAs do not apply, and it also means that we can talk about it because once it's in public, NDAs also don't apply to this particular review. So let's get... Is there anything in particular that you wanted to start with in terms of looking through some of the performance stuff? I mean, I've got the specification table here. So this is the 11700K being an 8-core 16-thread processor, maximum clock speed 5 gigahertz according to Anantech, and that makes it interesting because the 11900K, the Core i9 part, also is going to be allegedly 8-core 16-thread according to this table here. So the 11700K is not that cut down. It's not like they've disabled hyper-threading. It's not like it's got lower cores. It's just a slightly lower clocked model. So a lot of the performance here should be close to what I think we'd see from the 11900K.
Definitely. Can only be a few percent different, really, for most workloads.
Yeah.
So they're talking about a 200 megahertz difference from 4.6 gigahertz to 4.8 gigahertz for the all-core.
Yep.
Negligible difference there. I mean, that's the kind of difference we usually see when you go from, like, a Core i7 part to the next one down in the stack. So very small difference when we're talking about Core i7 to Core i9 branding on the desktop. You would expect a more significant difference, normally an increase in core count, but for various reasons they weren't able to offer the 10-core 20-thread part this time.
They have said that this platform is going to be up to 8 cores, so we know that's definitely the case. And in fact, Intel has publicly talked about, for example, what CPU core we've got. It's Cypress Cove. It has, I believe they've talked about the IPC gains, which is similar to what we've seen from Ice Lake previously. PCIe Gen 4, 20 lanes of PCIe from the CPU. So these are all just the basic specifications that Intel has released publicly, and also obviously Ian has been able to find all this stuff out from his review as well. So it's not like we have no information from this product. I think Intel has tried to remind people that they exist over the past couple of months. I think they announced some of this stuff as far back as around the Zen 3 launch last year, when they were sort of sprinkling a few things out, talking about how they want to regain the lead in gaming or maintain their lead in gaming or whatever the situation. So yeah,
that's right.
It's been a bit of a slow burn on this.
Yeah, definitely. And once we sort of get into the benchmark results, I guess you'll see why. But as Ian suggests in this article, there are multiple reasons for why there isn't a 10-core part. The dies being much bigger, so there's power consumption concerns there. Obviously, you'd have to clock the cores lower, which then you get this really weird situation where in, say, the Core i9-11700K was a 10-core, 20-thread part. In a lot of workloads, it would end up being slower than the Core i7 part, and then that would just be... It'd look bad in graphs. It'd be a whole mess, confusing when it makes sense to buy the 10-core part and when it doesn't. Really, you want the Core i9 to be ahead of the Core i7 for every workload, whether it's all core, single core, the whole lot. And just depending on the type of workload and what it's doing there, the Core i7 may be faster. So I guess that's why, one of the reasons at least, why they opted not to do it. Other things are like costs as well. Like, you'd be looking at pretty extreme expenses there for a die that size.
Let's talk about the power consumption.
I was going to say,
let's get into that first. So this is the first page of the AnandTech review. Again, I'm not going to show all parts of the review there, because that would obviously be unfair on AnandTech. You should go read their article if you want to see all the individual bits and pieces, all the individual benchmarks and all that. But there are some interesting things that I want to just point out and talk about, maybe a couple of graphs here and there. And I think the first one is probably this peak power chart that's been seen at the bottom of the second page and also in the conclusion, which sort of compares 11700K in... It's got AVX2, AVX512 there, and it's got some comparisons to 10700K, 5800X, and so on. And it's a power-hungry part. There's no doubt about it, looking at that chart, that according to their data, it's nearly 300 watts using AVX512 for this sort of part is crazy.
Definitely. Well, I mean, yes for the AVX512 stuff. The AVX2 is probably what I'd focus on more, because at least with that you can make some direct comparisons to the 10700K and the 5800X as well.
Yep.
So the 5800X is very efficient. It's not quite clear what workload that is in. Like, these numbers are a bit different to what we've published comparing those two CPUs, but we use Blender. So
yeah, this might be like, this might be like peak of all the AVX2 workloads that were being run or something like that.
Yeah, and we report the average power consumption throughout the duration of the benchmark. So it's you get different numbers. Also, we test without the TDP limitations in place for reasons we've discussed in the past quite often. Generally, that's how you will be configured out of the box. So it just makes sense to do that rather than go and change a whole heap of settings in the BIOS. Interesting. It'll be obviously very interesting ourselves when we can dig into it later in the month and perhaps compare power consumption when gaming as well as various applications. It's always important when you're measuring power consumption to actually show the resulting performance in that application, so you can get your sort of performance per watt information there. But obviously the AVX 512 stuff is insane. I don't know how practical that is, because what did they say? The CPU was hitting within seconds. It was hitting 90 degrees and then going up to 104 degrees as the peak temperature.
Yeah.
And they were using quite a substantial cooler, if I recall correctly. It's a cooler that I reviewed and tested a very, very long time ago. I don't know if this is an updated version. Having a look at the product page, I don't think so, because it doesn't have any mention of Ryzen or whatever. Anyway, it's made by Thermalright. It is a massive copper air cooler, huge copper heatsink. It weighs almost, it's 1.9 kilograms, so almost 2 kilograms. Absolutely huge air cooler. Certainly one of the best you can get for air cooling performance. So that is what they're strapping onto the 11700K and the other Intel processors. So
yeah, and I think they mentioned they have plenty of thermal headroom when they were talking about these things, like that cooler has serious cooling capacity.
I think, well, they don't have thermal headroom in the sense that it was hitting 100 degrees. I think what they're saying is the heatsink isn't being saturated with heat where it can't deal with it.
Yeah.
What that means for I imagine the bulk of our audience really does care about gaming performance. They want to know how many frames are going to in games, how much power it's going to use when gaming compared to something like the 10700K, maybe the Ryzen 7 5800X. So power consumption, thermals there. And we don't have that information yet. So that is absent from this AnandTech article. And that's not something we normally look at either, but I think with the way things are heading, and they're so close in terms of FPS performance now that maybe a sort of a deeper investigation into how much power and thermals you're looking at when gaming will be worth adding to our review. So that's probably something we'll do. In fact, I'm certain that's something we'll do.
Yep.
But yeah, basically for your AVX accelerated type workloads, sort of the stuff we look at, the power consumption looks pretty extreme. And I guess, would you say AVX 512 still pretty niche for especially desktop usage?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at one of the benchmarks, for example, like the performance benchmarks, AnandTech does have one here from an AVX 512 workload where this is clearly an advantage of the 11th gen part, just going on this review. Basically, it destroys the non-AVX 512 parts. So being a desktop part in this sort of mainstream market that offers AVX 512 is good if you need it as a niche workload. But at the same time, you can see this using 290 watts of power, or peak power, and clearly this is still a niche application because it's just not something you're going to see across the majority of workloads today. AVX 512 has been available, I think, in server applications for a little while now, maybe one or two generations, and it still is only adopted in a couple of things. So yes, I guess from one perspective, you could say this is an advantage for this part, but on the balance of the productivity results, if we look more across some of those results...
Sorry, just to interrupt. I should note that their AVX 512 benchmark is also a synthetic test. So yes. I believe it's an in-house built benchmark. So they don't actually have a real-world test to show those differences. But with the i7-11700K, they are looking at like a 500% performance uplift.
Yep.
So the fact that it uses a lot more power and stuff, it's like, well, it is 500% faster.
It's definitely more efficient for sure at that work.
As I was saying, as I was saying originally, though, how practical it is. So you really can't cool it to get that performance. Like 100 plus degrees is not a satisfactory temperature when you've got an almost 2 kilo air cooler on it.
So it'll
that's
definitely
not even the bottleneck.
Down. Yeah, it'll definitely be clocking down, and you need to use an offset and all that. If we look at the rest of the performance numbers, again, I don't want to show every single benchmark because, of course, you should go and look at AnandTech's review, but just some of the stuff that you might be familiar with. They've got a whole bunch of office science simulation stuff, but I think the stuff that we would normally be talking about is sort of more your rendering workloads, things like Blender, things like Corona that we've tested with. And you can see that let's take Blender, for example. The 11700K is shown here as being very slightly faster than 5800X. Again, sort of, it does have a performance lead on the 10700K, which you would expect given that we are seeing IPC improvements on the same core count part. And this table is quite nice in that it only has the 8 core parts, so we're getting quite a nice little core for core comparison here. Considering you'd say, for example, I don't think Intel is trying to compete with like a 5900X or 5950X with these sort of parts. I don't think 8 cores is going to be sufficient for those sort of things.
I'm going to reserve any opinion there until we see what the price is, because that will dictate what they're trying to compete with. Yep. If it's priced to match the 5800X, then it's pretty clear that's what they're targeting.
Yep.
But if it's priced up around the 12 core part, then we'll have to wait and see on that one.
Yeah, I believe what AnandTech paid was between the price of a 5800X and a 5900X for the 11700K that they bought. Whether or not that's because of an early sample or not, we don't know.
Definitely a retailer trying to cash in and bump up the price to... I'm pretty sure that was the situation there. So I would consider that more of a scalper price, what they paid.
Yeah, so I mean, if we continue looking at benchmarks, for example, Corona, another benchmark that we often use, the 11700K sits between a 10700K and a 5800X. So again, that's not a particularly great result for Intel, given that it's way less efficient than a 5800X, and even core for core in that particular workload, it doesn't appear to be matching the performance that AMD is currently offering with 8 cores. I would say that for this part and the 11900K as well, once people are allowed to review that really the minimum performance expectation for these parts is 5800X level. It really has to be around that. Would you agree with that?
Again, depends on price, but you would hope so that would be the step they've made. It looks at the moment, based on this, that's kind of a best case scenario.
Yeah, it really
the
does.
Zen 3 part. Because if we go like right down, I think down the bottom, again, we don't really want to show all the benchmarks, but again, we will have the link to their article in the video description, and they go into a lot more depth than we do with our CPU coverage. I'd say Ian is the gold standard for CPU reviews, so it is definitely worth clicking the link in the video description, jumping over and reading the whole thing, especially because you've got to wait 3.5 weeks before you get any benchmarks from us, so you've got plenty of time to do it. So definitely check that out. But if we jump over to jump down rather to the Cinebench R20 results, you see that single thread performance is still well behind the 5800X, which is, I find quite surprising.
Yeah, same. Very surprising.
So, yeah.
I mean, Cinebench, it's not, the single thread test in Cinebench isn't always representative of single thread applications out there.
True.
An app like Photoshop, for example, doesn't always give you the same results as Cinebench single thread, but at the same time, you kind of would be wanting, with the sort of frequencies that Intel are hitting on this processor, which is, I think it has a maximum turbo clock of 5 gigahertz, and the 5800X tops out at 4.6, 4.7 off the top of my head. So I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't review these CPUs, but yeah, with that frequency advantage that Intel has, I would really have expected this part to be hitting the 600 points plus range in that benchmark.
Yeah, I would have thought so. And just for a little bit of extra information, I think I alluded to this earlier, there are some BIOS updates coming in. So Anantech didn't mention the Z590 board they used for testing, just to protect the manufacturer or whatever. They didn't want to involve them in any blowback from Intel. Even though Intel said they don't care to comment on this and there's nothing they can really do about it. The damage is already done. But there are some BIOS updates coming that will improve performance in some areas by what I believe are fairly insignificant margins. So between now and when we do our review, we're talking about maybe 1% or 2% improvement in some areas. So these results really are as good as it's going to get. I
think it's important there to note as well that from what we're hearing from partners, these chips have been in the hands of motherboard partners for some time now. So it doesn't sound like this is a situation where Ian has bought this CPU and is using it with like a day or 2 day old BIOS from the motherboard manufacturers. Well, these boards have been available for a while. The BIOSes are certainly they've had some time.
Yeah, I'm comfortable saying this. I started testing the 11900K 2 weeks ago, and that was the official review package that I got. Some YouTubers have already shown this, so I don't really care. I'm going to show it. So we got the big box, the official thing. So this is the strap off it. So we got the official 11900K. I also got a sample about a month before that. So we've had these CPUs in hand for a long time now. I haven't actually signed an NDA with Intel, but I've signed up with board partners. So yeah, we know what a lot of these results should look like. And so there's no real surprises here. But I haven't got into all of our testing yet because, as I said,
it's not a high priority when it's 3 weeks away.
I typically, don't get a review ready 3 weeks in advance because, BIOS updates and things. We have been told there will be a few more BIOS updates to come before we should really get into our testing. But they're not expected to make any radical changes to performance. So that's basically what we can say at this point in time. And I'm more comfortable talking about it now that we have reviews like this already online. So it's a little bit ridiculous.
I find this Cinebench number, the single thread number as well, interesting from a perspective of I've been testing a fair few of Intel's mobile processors in the 11th gen line, which use Tiger Lake. So Tiger Lake is different in that, well, first of all, it's on 10 nanometer, not 14 nanometers. So Intel has the advantage of they're not trying to make a giant processor on an old node. And it doesn't clock as high as the 11700K because of that. So I think the samples we've seen so far with like an 1185 G7 are getting up to 4.8 gigahertz, whereas this chip is doing 5 gigahertz. So that's kind of the difference that we've seen so far. And I believe the 11900K will clock even higher than that. So that kind of shows you the reason why they'd use 14 nanometer. But on the same point, the Tiger Lake parts that I've seen score above this in single thread Cinebench R20 numbers. Seeing a score around the 600 mark from those parts is fairly common. AMD's Ryzen 5000 mobile parts also do around the 600 point mark in that particular test. So the fact that the 11700K in Anantech's numbers, and they've even noted down the bottom here that their mobile testing has shown a score of 593 for Tiger Lake. The fact that this 11700K is below that, it's not a particularly great result, I wouldn't have said, given that they spent all that time backporting this part, or backporting a similar core architecture. It's not the exact same as Tiger Lake, but it's similar, to not be able to match their mobile parts. I don't know whether the backporting would have been, that's the result they would have wanted from the backporting process.
Yeah, I guess that's key to note, that you you obviously lose some optimization in the backport process. So the larger chip, for example, we already know that increases things like latency. So there are some disadvantages there that do hurt performance. I guess that's what we're looking at.
And Tiger Lake has more cache. With the Willow Cove design, they increased one of the performance improvements they got over Ice Lake was increasing the amount of cache that you get in a certain core count. Whereas this design that we're seeing with Cypress Cove is more closely aligned, what we believe, with Ice Lake, which doesn't have that cache improvement. So again, could they have even put more cache on this die on 14 nanometers? Probably not, given I would say they're very close to the limits of what they can do on that sort of size. So again, that seems to be impacting performance, as we're seeing in these results with stuff like Cinebench R20. So
I think the key thing to note with the application benchmarks, though, I'm just quickly scrolling through to make sure this is an accurate statement. It seems like for the most part, we are looking at a performance uplift. In some instances, quite a substantial one. But as far as productivity, general applications, general desktop PC usage, it looks like the 11700K is a reasonable step forward from the 10700K. Worst case, they're like similar in terms of performance, but there are some reasonable performance uplifts here and there. Unfortunately, a lot of the reasonable performance uplifts still see it coming behind the 5800X, but it is a step forward for Intel, and that's where things become quite interesting when we start to look at the gaming benchmarks, which we're probably going to get into in a minute. I don't want to jump too far ahead of you, Tim.
That's probably the next step. I mean, sort of wrapping up the productivity results that we've seen from this review, it's fairly clear that, as you say, at best, if I was going to summarize this, I'd say it trades blows with the 5800X, but it never really seems to outperform it. And certainly, for the most part, it sits between sort of your 10700K and your 5800X in terms of performance, while using a fair bit more power than a 5800X. So again, it's really going to come down to retail pricing on whether, for a productivity user that's not really interested in like a 12 core or $500 plus AMD part, where those parts are clearly superior to this. There's just no way this is getting close to a 12 core processor. It's really going to come down to the pricing, because this would have to be priced below a 5800X for productivity buyers, that is, to make it worth recommending. And right now, the 5800X, I'd say, is the most available of AMD's Ryzen 5000 processors. You can right now on PC Keski, you can buy them. They seem to be fairly common in most regions.
It is there is some Zen 3 supply issues. There are a lot of supply issues, and we don't know how ongoing they're going to be. So in some ways, Intel won't necessarily win, but they'll get their foot in the door by default.
Yep.
So it may just be the easier option to purchase.
That's right.
Of course, there are also the motherboard costs, which look pretty horrendous. So that's sort of been the Achilles heel, let's say, of the sort of the Intel processor options. Stuff like even their 10th gen processors, a lot of them now, if you look just at the CPU, are better value than even Zen 2, especially Zen 3.
Yep.
But then when you factor in the cost of the motherboard, they end up being very similar. So there's a lot more things to consider yet.
I'd say that's an interesting point as well, from the fact that you can use an 11700K on a Z490 motherboard, so you don't necessarily need to buy the Z590 boards. But at the same time, a lot of these productivity results, I'd say, and it's not worth, like if you'd already bought a 10th gen part on a Z490 board, at least for productivity that we've looked at so far, it's not really giving you enough of an upgrade.
That's right.
That's not going to be a worthwhile thing. So again, it's going to come down to the platform discussion of CPU plus motherboard versus either just directly a CPU or CPU plus motherboard on the AMD side, where that sits. And of course, we don't have pricing, so it's hard to make that conclusion for now. Let's get into gaming, though. I think you're probably most excited to talk about gaming results.
Yes.
It's interesting. Well, it's not what I expected. Not what I expected.
No, not what I expected at all. And I haven't actually done any game testing myself. So I'd done a bit of exploring the productivity benchmarks, just your Cinebench 20 stuff, and see what was there. I did a bit of that before I went on holiday, just to start setting things up, making sure everything was working as it should be. Didn't bother with gaming tests because they're a lot more work, and I'll wait till closer to the date to test those out. So my assumption was, especially based on what Tim had sort of seen on the laptop front, and especially what Intel had been saying, that we would see some improvement in gaming performance. And that certainly seemed to be the general consensus, I think, throughout the industry. A lot of people were making the assumption that we would see improved gaming performance. And that hasn't really been the case. Some games there is... I guess it's a bit like the applications, but a bit more mixed. So we have seen some instances where there is a pretty substantial performance improvement for some games, but in a lot of instances, there's a regression, and that's not really something you want to see, and not something we were expecting to see. I think I was probably expecting absolute worst case that the performance would be the same.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Not that you would be going backwards. And I've mainly focused on looking at their 1080p max data, because I sort of find the low resolution stuff, while interesting for science type test, not terribly useful, because already like 1080p max with they're using an RTX 2080 Ti, it's debatable as to how useful that information is, but it's good for...
It doesn't even appear to advantage the Intel i7-11700K all that much anyway by testing at a lower resolution in a lot of these titles. It's very similar to the 1080p data.
Yep, that's right. So... are we going to go through each game sort of individually? I imagine we wouldn't be doing that.
No,
so do we
I
want
think
to just talk about...
If you want to see all the games individually, you should definitely go and read the Anantech review. Again, I don't want to go and show every single benchmark that they're showing. So I think you did some generalized numbers. Or are there any outliers that you think are worth looking at? The sort of the most interesting examples?
Probably... Let's just leave it. If you want to see the individual game tests, definitely go to Anantech, read through their article and check that out. I'll just give you sort of the summary. So I did an average of all the results, a geo mean, and found that you're looking at 151 FPS overall for the 10700K, sort of on average across the games. And then it was just a 2 FPS increase for the 11700K. So I think they looked at about a dozen games?
Yeah, so the games being Deus Ex, Mankind Divided, a couple of Final Fantasies, World of Tanks, Borderlands 3, F1 2019, Far Cry 5. They've got Gears Tactics, GTA 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, and Strange Brigade. So most of those games, I'd say, especially if you're testing at 1080p, are going to be CPU limited. Certainly games like Borderlands 3, Far Cry 5, Gears games, GTA... Those are games that we've tested. I mean, you don't test all those games right now for CPU workloads, but some of those today...
They're very... Yeah. So there's some overlap there, but I'd say that's overall quite different to the batch of games that we use for CPU testing. However, the results overall, I think they found that the Ryzen 7 5800X was like 4% faster than the 10700K. I found it to be 6% faster, but they're using a 2080 Ti and I'm using a 3090. So the 2% difference there can be made up by the faster GPU. So overall, our performance margins between the AMD and Intel CPUs seem very similar. So they're finding that the 11700K is like 1.3% faster than the 10700K across all the games tested.
Yep.
And that's because sometimes it is quite a bit faster, sometimes it's a bit more, often it's a bit slower. So no real improvement then in terms of gaming performance. And again, it is worth keeping in mind that we're talking about 1080p with an RTX 2080 Ti. It is maximum in-game quality settings, but we're pushing the gaming performance more into a situation where it's more likely to be CPU bound than GPU bound.
That's right.
Again, it depends on the game that's used for testing, but if you start using a 2080 Ti at what I would say is a more typical or more common resolution for such a graphics card like 1440p, that 1.3% margin is definitely going to shrink to 0. So really, overall, in terms of gaming performance, there is no difference between those two CPUs. And the same is really true for the 5800X, although it's 4% faster in Anantech's results. as we've shown or tried to show in our GPU scaling benchmarks, once you start testing under, or gaming rather, under more realistic conditions, that the CPU becomes a lot less important, especially if you've got a modern CPU. Like if you've got anything sort of 10th gen from Intel, or even 9th gen, 8th gen, and then a Zen 3 processor, there's going to be no difference. Zen 2, still there's not much difference really. Like sometimes you'll see a 5% difference, which is only a couple of frames. I think we're really getting to a point now where the CPUs for gaming don't really matter too much, as long as you have if you've got something that's relatively modern, it's got 6 cores, 12 threads, you're good to go. And that really just comes down to what makes the most sense in terms of, money, how much you have to spend on it.
Yeah,
so which is why
today.
Yeah. That's why we find something like Gamers Nexus as well. I'm wearing the Gamers Nexus Disappointment 2022 shirt, by the way. So thanks for sending that over, Steve. Very cool. But they found, like us, that something like the Ryzen 5 3600 is just an awesome value CPU when it was released around $200, and then it dropped down to like $150, $160, because under realistic gaming conditions, you weren't really giving up any performance, and it was a really cost-effective CPU. And with these pushing well beyond that, I really think we're at a point now where the CPU battle for gaming between AMD and Intel is pretty pointless. It's really just about benchmark charts now, who gets, ahead by a few frames under the sort of unrealistic conditions.
Yeah, that's right. And
so
it's really I find it very concerning for Intel from the perspective that all of the marketing that we've seen so far publicly from Intel has been about gaming on these processors. They haven't really been pushing it as a productivity option. They probably have talked a little bit about that side of things, probably focusing on, say, your accelerator stuff, the general stuff that Intel focuses on. But the primary thing that they want people to buy these parts for is for gaming. They want to keep their lead in gaming, or at least switch it from a situation where they're slightly slower than AMD to being slightly faster. And based on this data, it just does not seem like that is happening or is possible, because while they are getting the IPC improvements from the new core design, there has been a regression in latency. And I believe it's one of the earlier tests that you can see on Anantech's review, where they have this core-to-core latency example, or cache latency, or something along those lines. And
I think it was L3.
I believe, L3, something about that. I've just found it now. Core estimated structural latency comparison, and the 11700K delivers slightly longer latency than the 10700K in most instances. And we know gaming is very latency sensitive, so whether or not that was what they were hoping to achieve when they made this part, I would imagine their goal would have been to keep latency the same while improving IPC and frequency if they could, so that you would then get a gaming performance improvement. But if they're improving IPC and latency is coming back the other way, then you start to see these situations, or what appears to be happening, where it is slightly faster in games where IPC is more important, and then it's slightly slower in games where latency is more important. And that makes it a very hard situation for Intel to beat a 5800X or higher end parts. And there's still a Core i9 part to test where frequencies are going to be, 5% higher at best. And then you put that up against like a 5900X or 5950X. It doesn't look like a very favorable comparison for Intel at the moment. It doesn't look like where I would have expected Intel to be, because I was not expecting these latency results.
No, exactly. I was... Same expectations here. I was certainly expecting slightly better gaming performance than what we ended up with. So
it's really a case where Intel might just be the option for, say, the outlier cases. Like if you're really into, I know they haven't really tested games like this, but sort of maybe your large-scale real-time strategy games, or potentially like a Microsoft Flight Simulator, like one of those hardcore simulators that's really single-threaded, then potentially, again, we haven't tested it, but...
I don't expect them to have any performance advantage in those sort of applications or games either, or simulators, because I don't think they have that single thread performance with these desktop parts. I think for the most part they're slightly down. But again, I don't think that you would, based on the performance alone, you would buy a 5800X over 700K or vice versa. I think that they're
Yep.
so evenly matched. Performance is essentially the same. You're never going to notice a difference between the two. We're not talking about like first gen Ryzen where there was a massive latency penalty, and depending on whether if you're going for really high frame rates in your sort of your esports titles, then Intel was quite clearly the better option. AMD, Intel, doesn't matter at this point which one you buy of their 8-core processors. Gaming performance is going to be indistinguishable. So it comes down to availability and pricing, and I think that's going to be the key here. And I think that's what's going to keep Intel afloat during this generation, is that they will probably have better availability than AMD. Pricing's yet to be seen. It depends how competitive they can be. Obviously, these are going to be quite big dies, so they probably can't afford to undercut AMD, but AMD's, through becoming more competitive, gone up to meet Intel on pricing. So
that's right.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens there.
I mean, even in a best case scenario where, they've tested the 11700K. In a best case scenario, let's say an 11900K matches a 5800X. So it closes up that little bit in the gaming performance gap that you've talked about. It gets a bit closer to some of those productivity workloads. So it ends up being basically the same sort of part. Then you're looking at a situation where Intel can't really price that over $450, which is the position that the 5800X sits in. And even then, I'd say that most people probably wouldn't look at buying the Intel part, assuming availability is solved, at the same price, simply because the 5800X is more efficient, and you're maybe going to be more likely to have an AM4 motherboard that you could slot that part into. Of course, that depends on the system that you're coming from. If you're coming from something really old, then the platform argument comes more down to platform price. But it becomes a hard sell, and I think we've seen Intel claw back at least a little bit of share lately, because parts like a 10400F or 10700KF and those parts are very affordable and much lower priced than their launch prices. But they can't come out and give this product a $450 price and expect it to be a leader in the market based on this review. It's just not going to happen.
That's right. We've been saying that AMD can't really price their Radeon GPUs at parity with GeForce GPUs because they're missing key features. They haven't got the same level of encoder support. They don't yet have an answer to something like DLSS. Ray tracing performance just isn't there, whether you care about ray tracing or not right now. Fact remains, their ray tracing performance just isn't there yet. So they can't go charging. They certainly can't charge a premium, and they really can't get away with charging the same amount. So you've sort of done a few polls to work out what kind of discount they need to offer in order for people to see it as being a viable option, let's say.
Yep.
And I think we're looking at the same here with Intel. So as I just said, as far as I'm concerned, performance doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. They're both great gaming processors. Which one you have, you'll not notice a difference when it comes to playing your games. So what are the other factors there? And you've got stuff like the platform costs and what platform features you get, efficiency, so power consumption, stuff like that. And it seems like all of those things are going to end up going in AMD's favor. Again, we're making a few assumptions here. We haven't tested a lot of this stuff and seen prices and whatnot. But it seems like, a lot of this stuff is going to end up in AMD's favor, which will make their option more desirable overall.
Yeah, and something that
availability.
Something you haven't even factored in there is also the cooling cost, because we haven't tested this obviously at this point, but who knows sort of whether this level of performance requires that sort of expensive, massive copper cooler that Anantec used, or your high-end liquid coolers or high-end air coolers. Who knows whether that is a requirement to get the performance being shown here for the 11700K. For example, if you're using a lower-end cooler, if performance drops off further, then that's going to impact this whole situation even more. Whereas something like a 5800X is a little bit easier to cool and get the performance that is shown in reviews with a lower-end cooler. So that's another factor that's going to come into this that will require further testing, obviously. And it's going to be interesting.
That's right. The typical argument where it's like, well, it's a high-end 400-ish, whatever it may be, part, so it's quite an expensive CPU. I'm happy to go spend $150 on a 360mm AIO or whatever it may be. And traditionally that argument's held up because the Intel part was a premium part. You got the absolute best gaming performance. So spending, sort of quite a bit more money, let's say, on a cooler, that was fine. But now it's like, well, you can do that for the Intel processor, but it's still not faster. Or at best, it's the same.
Yeah, you're not buying the high roller part. Like spend all the cash that you want to buy the fastest of the fastest process. And again, this is the 11700K. It's not the 11900K. So again, it could be the fastest, but we'll be talking about such a slim margin that would you really spend an extra $100 on cooling this part to get the performance that's being shown?
Yeah, I think probably one of the more shocking things to come later in the month is the fact that this is essentially 11900K review.
Yeah.
Like, I think some people may be thinking in the back of their heads, oh, well, this is only the 11700K. It's the Core i7 part. You know, the Core i9 part, going to be a bit more powerful. That's going to leave, you know, the Ryzen 7 part behind. And we're sort of thinking, at best, it may match it. We're essentially looking at the same review here. We're talking about 200 megahertz improvement for all-core based on what AnandTech's saying. So, yeah, it's a couple of percent more at best.
Yeah, I think this whole review has been, again, it's worth reading the entire thing and seeing all the performance charts so you can get a good idea of what we've been talking about. But speaking from my expectations of performance, but when I saw this review pop up in my feed, for example, I was like, oh, that's going to be interesting. It'll be interesting to see where this sort of sits in terms of, you know, Intel's made some claims, blah, blah, blah. And reading the whole thing, my final conclusion is very disappointing. It's a very disappointing part if this is the performance that is going to be seen across all reviews come the NDA date, which I expect, given AnandTech's quality of benchmarking that they've done over a period of time now, that this is going to be very, very close to what most people will see. So, yeah, it really is not a good situation for Intel, given that we don't have the argument anymore of this being, oh, it's Skylake but clocked faster again, or something along those lines. Oh, it's Skylake but it's not 6 cores, it's 8 cores. It's not 8 cores, it's 10 cores. This is a new architecture, and they specifically did this on 14 nanometer to get the frequencies that they needed to deliver the best single thread performance and the best gaming performance. And even when they did that, even when they gave their close to newest architecture the best process that they had available to them, they still aren't in the region of matching or beating AMD's performance with their newest architecture and on their newest node. And I think that is not a great outcome for this generation. Not great at all, really.
No, it's not, but
I mean, what can they do?
They were always making the best of a bad situation. I think Ian even said that in his review.
Yep.
So, yeah, I'm sure the engineers were thrilled about having to backport these designs that they had, you know, ready to work on 10 nanometer. So that's really what it is. It's the best of a bad situation. And unfortunately, even though our expectations weren't particularly high for it, it hasn't really met those expectations.
Yeah, I was expecting it, I guess, to be obviously not in the realm of the 12, 16 core parts of productivity, but I was certainly expecting it to be as good as a 5800X in most applications. And then for gaming, I was expecting it to be maybe like a 5% faster than an equivalent AMD part in the best scenarios. That was sort of my expectation, but to see kind of go the other way was, just a bit of a shock. Not that I think 5% faster in gaming would have really changed the argument all that much in terms of which product was worth buying, but it certainly would have allowed Intel to have the marketing of the fastest gaming processor, which we know is very important to them. Whereas with this review, they can't even say that. So
that's right. And with this review, AnandTech has only looked at the 8 core parts, which has made the graphs all nice and easy to make comparisons with. But as I was saying a moment ago, this really is an 11900K review as well.
Close to it,
At best, we're going to see maybe a 4 or 5% improvement in certain areas. And that review, though, would surely include the 10900K.
Yeah.
So I think that is going to be a bit of a brutal review for Intel. Again, not knowing pricing, but comparing the 8-core part to the 10-core part and not the equivalent. Because if you have a look here and you're looking at the 11700K versus the 10700K in productivity, it's like the performance uplift isn't that huge.
Yeah, I
So
think they
while
said, Anantech said here, for example, in floating point it was like 19% faster, but then
That's
in
right.
integer workloads it was like multi-thread 7% faster, single thread 13% faster.
And that's what we're seeing, like the 7%, 7 to 13% is what we're seeing in a lot of these productivity benchmarks.
Yep.
And that's not going to cut it for the 11900K versus the 10900K.
Exactly.
So again, we don't know what the pricing's going to look like between those two parts. But if it's priced anywhere near the 10900K, that's going to be a huge blow. And then compared to like the 5900X, it's going to be horrendous.
And again, so, I don't expect the 10900K was ever like the productivity choice for many people, given that AMD has sort of been holding it, especially with Zen 3 matching and beating it in single thread performance. It really became the choice for productivity. But if you're going to get rid of your productivity and just ignore that by not making a 10 core part and keeping it to 8 cores, focusing on single thread frequency, gaming performance, and then you don't actually beat the competing part in any of those areas, what's left? It's a more it's a more power hungry part, etc.
Yeah, and also if we make the assumption that pricing, they want to slot these parts in at the same price points, which I don't really know how they're going to do that. It wouldn't really make sense that they do that. So surely the 11900K will come in below the 10900K in terms of price.
Don't know. I don't think Intel's done that in the past.
Well, if they do slot it at the same price, it's going to be a disaster because the 11900K is going to be worse pretty much across the board than the part that it's replacing from productivity to gaming. Like, at best, it'll be the same. So,
yep.
I think that review is going to be pretty rough. But anyway, we'll have to wait and see later in the month on that one.
Yeah, it certainly is an interesting... it's a very interesting review. Very, very interesting. It's worth reading as much of it as you can. And yeah, it almost begs the question as to why you would even release this generation. I'm sure they're expecting better things maybe from this process, and they kind of, you start going down the process of backporting, you do all the work, you've got the product, you need an 11th gen part, so you got to put something out, and you've done all this work, so you may as well put out the part that they've spent all this time on. But at the same time, could they have just gotten away with essentially keeping the 10700K and 10900K in the market? It just doesn't seem that there's much here to get excited about. Like the 10700K, if you're focusing on the gaming market and that was sort of your thing that you were trying to capture, then a 10700K, 10900K would have done the job. Similar sort of thing to this. So especially if this is costing them more to manufacture than those parts were. It's kind of like you make a part that's only slightly better, if that, and then it costs you more to make, so you're kind of just losing money overall. It's a weird situation, especially if they have to price it lower to compete. It's a real crunch on them with this particular product.
I guess it depends on how much having like an 11th gen part helps boost sales.
It's true.
And create hype for a new generation, so that could be part of it as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we've been going for about an hour now on this review, which is probably longer than it takes to actually read the review from start to finish. So
we did a poor job of summarizing it. But yeah, there really are thoughts. So probably disappointing overall based on this sort of early review.
Yep.
But yeah, more to come.
Yeah, and I think one of the lines mentioned here in the end of Anantech's review here, but the clear answer during this chip crunch is to buy the processor you can find at a reasonable price. And that kind of is the situation in the market just overall right now across GPUs, CPUs, everything, is that it could come when everyone can talk about these products on March 30th that Ryzen processors are still hard to find, which kind of makes a lot of the performance stuff irrelevant to some degree, like we're seeing on the GPU side, where it's just, if you have a certain amount of money, just try and buy whatever you can get. But yeah, for the future, it's probably why Intel is looking to replace this lineup with Alder Lake as early as this year. So a 6 month, this product may only be on the market for 6 months, who knows. But certainly an interesting review, certainly a lot of conclusions that I don't think either of us were expecting, and hopefully you've enjoyed our analysis a little bit of what it's kind of something we haven't really done before, is looking at someone else's review and talked about it this way. But these sort of reviews don't come around too often, I wouldn't have thought.
No, this is definitely unusual and definitely worth having a discussion about for sure, especially given that we do have CPUs in hand and are currently testing them, but we can't show the results for another 3.5 weeks.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to sort of... It also allows us to, I guess, gauge what our audience thinks about these parts, get your thoughts and feelings. We'll obviously be reading all of your comments below. So it'll be very interesting to hear from you guys and see what you think about the i7-11700K based on what we've seen so far from AnandTech.
Yeah, and they'll certainly inform a lot of our coverage going forward, the reviews and also any follow-up content. If we see from this early review and the discussion around it that the interest is perhaps not there or wasn't as high as it might have been otherwise, then I guess we'll prioritize other things. Obviously, we'll still review these processes. That is 100% a given. But beyond that, it does give us a good indication of what to spend our time on in these sort of in these periods. I guess there's not a whole lot to cover anyway at this point, so it's kind of going to be...
Well, yeah. I've been collecting already Z590 motherboards. Having seen the power requirements here, I am more interested in having a look at VRM thermal performance and seeing how those cheaper boards, I should say cheaper boards, they're still quite expensive, so how the more entry-level boards perform, because we did see quite a few fails with Z490 motherboards. So
maybe you should get an AVX 512 workload for your motherboard testing for Z590, because the power consumption is a fair bit higher going on this review. Definitely want something to look out for.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say if you want to run AVX 512 workloads, probably don't buy the cheapest Z590 motherboard you can. Probably go for one with one of those overkill VRMs.
Yeah.
But CPU cooling and all that sort of stuff is a concern as well.
It may not be overkill if you actually need the overkill to run the processor at the required frequencies for AVX 512.
What is typically deemed overkill will be the requirement for AVX 512 accelerated workloads.
Hey, good for the motherboard manufacturers. They'll be very excited to have their high-end designs actually have some worth in terms of VRM now.
16 phases is no longer considered dumb. Anyway, we'll have to see about all of that. Probably early next month I'll get to all that sort of stuff.
All right.
But anyway, not too much more to say on this one.
Yeah, I think that's probably it. It's been a long discussion. We'll probably upload this in one part on the channel. So
good luck.
Yeah, you can have a bit of fun watching this through to the end, but we always appreciate the people that do watch right to the end. And become a Patreon or Float Play member if you haven't already. A lot of people watching at this point probably are, because they're kind of the die-hard fans that want to hear our dumb opinions for an hour. So It's been great. Had a lot of support recently from there, especially with all the YouTube stuff that's happened recently.
Yes, really appreciate all of that. That certainly helped calm my nerves a bit during that period. And we are catching up on things. So the RTX 3060 review, I think 2 days from now, probably a Monday night release for us. So that'll be ready for then. And then beyond that point, we'll be back on track. We'll be up to date with everything. So you'll see like 6700 XT reviews go live when everyone else's does, and there'll be plenty of follow-up benchmarks and big comparisons and all the usual stuff we do. So
absolutely,
no more holidays for me. That's it. I'm quitting them. I'm done for the year. Too much work.
Fair enough.
So anyway, not much more to say apart from thanks for watching. Do all the if you're interested in float plane, Patreon, all that stuff. Links are in the video description. Also, the AnandTech article, again, link in the video description. Do go show those guys support. Check them out. Ian does awesome work. Just thanks for watching. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim. See you
next time.
Next time.